Hello, and welcome to another episode from Season 6 of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a passion for scary movies. Each week we pick a different horror movie and dissect it to figure out what it was trying to accomplish, how well it did, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're changing things up. We're devoting a whole season to reviewing Esquire's list of the 50 scariest movies of all time. In each episode, we'll break down a different movie, talk about how scary it really was, and then update our rankings to prove how much smarter we are than the other people on the internet. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. As we've been working our way through Esquire's rather questionable list of the 50 scariest movies of all time, I feel like there have kind of been some different combinations of movies, in that there are movies that aren't good and also aren't scary, and that's what a lot of them have been. There's also been movies that are not scary, but they're like good movies. And then there are a very few on this list that I feel like are both good movies and scary. And for me, The Shining actually fell into that category.
Yes, couldn't say any better myself.
I was pleasantly surprised, and I really enjoyed watching it.
Yeah, it was one of those rare movies where I bought it as soon as I was done watching it. Yeah. Because, we generally rent or try to watch these for free, but this one I was like, I need this one.
Yeah. So had you not seen it before?
So I seen bits and pieces of it before. I seen bits and pieces, but not the full thing altogether.
Yeah.
And I think it was probably my guess, because I was trying to think of why I hadn't. And my guess is just because it's a long movie.
Yeah,
and
it definitely
I just didn't really appreciate those at the time. But yeah, I don't know why. One of those kind of regrets, but yeah, super pumped on it.
Yeah, I had seen it years ago, but it was really interesting to come back to it after a couple of years of watching and overanalyzing horror movies with you. So going back to it with a little more, I guess, analytical viewpoint. But yeah, it really held up and it really did well. And it's kind of interesting to me because typically a lot of the, I guess, more popular or Hollywood type movies we're not into. But I feel like two movies that are ones that kind of everybody's seen on this list are Jaws and The Shining, and we've actually liked both of those. So sometimes there's a movie that's popular because it's actually good.
But with this one's a Stephen King movie, which we've kind of had almost a love-hate relationship in the past about. So this one, but we'll get into that a little bit with some factoids.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. I actually have a thing that I want to talk about that was an observation I had based on this movie about how Stephen King books generally translate to the big screen. But yeah, we'll get to that after I introduce it and you give your facts.
Sounds good.
In 1980, Warner Brothers released The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. The Shining tells the story of a man who takes a job maintaining an isolated hotel in a remote part of the Rocky Mountains in the winter. While he and his family initially see the job as a chance to get away and reconnect, their lives descend into chaos as many horrors, both natural and supernatural, torment them. This movie was made on a budget of $19 million and brought in over $45 million at the box office. It can currently be rented for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. Blew my mind that this only made $45 million at the box office.
Yeah.
I feel like no one is not familiar with this movie.
Yeah, but it was also $45 million in 1970, which is 3,000 billion right now.
True, yeah. And I don't even want to think about how many Australian dollars that is.
So, a couple facts about this. So, this is technically Stephen King's script that he wrote, but supposedly Stanley Kubrick didn't even read the screenplay of Stephen King's. He initially Stephen King wrote the draft for the screenplay The Shining, but Kubrick didn't even deem it worth a glance. Instead he wrote the screenplay with Diane Johnson. Him and Diane Johnson wrote he was a fan of her book, The Shadow Knows. The two ended up spending 11 weeks working on the script. But Stephen King did have a cameo in the movie. It was in the 1920s party. He was like a busboy or something.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But
I didn't catch that.
Also, this is kind of interesting for me. It said Kubrick still had questions for Stephen King. The legendary story that King apparently still tells at some book readings. Stanley Kubrick called him at 7 a.m. to ask, "I think stories of the supernatural are fundamentally optimistic, don't you? If there are ghosts, then that means we survive death." When King responded with the question of how hell fit into that picture, Kubrick simply responded, "I don't believe in hell." Yeah. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Also, here's the other thing too. Supposedly, Stephen King was disappointed with Kubrick's adaptation. In a 1983 Playboy, Stephen King is quoted saying, "I admired Kubrick for a long time and had great expectations for the project, but I was deeply disappointed in the end result. Parts of the film were chilling, charged with a relentlessly claustrophobic terror, but others fell flat." He didn't like the casting of Jack Nicholson either, claiming Jack Nicholson, though a fine actor, was also wrong for the part. His last big role had been One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and between that and The Manic Grin, the audience automatically identified him as a loony from the first scene. But the book is about Jack Torrance's gradual descent into madness through the malign influence of the Overlook. If the guy is nuts to begin with, then the entire tragedy of the downfall is wasted.
Interesting.
Another thing, Room 217, there's always that Apollo, have you heard about how people think, there's a whole documentary on it, people think it's about Kubrick's, the moon landing was fake. One of the things is because the carpet looks like the Apollo launch pad, and in one of the scenes Danny's wearing an Apollo 11 sweater, and the room 237 is there's 237 million miles or whatever to the moon. I don't know, whatever the distance is 237, but the fact about that is the actual events in the book are set in room 217. However, Oregon's Timberland Lodge wanted that to change because they didn't want people to not want to rent out 217 because thinking there was something wrong with it. So they asked to change it. I think they asked to change it to 237 because they didn't have a room 237 at the hotel.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, I was getting confused when you were talking about 217 because I was like, where did that come in? But yeah. So the room that they were actually filming everything in was 217, but then they went back and changed it so that people would not refuse to stay in one of the rooms.
Yeah, initially in the book it was room 217 that they.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Here's another. Supposedly this is true. I don't know. But the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy supposedly wrote. It's rumored that Stanley Kubrick typed all those pages.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know if that's true or not, but supposedly it is.
I really liked that there were all the typos in that.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
It
was great. Yeah, I mean, it was exactly what it would be like if I was trying to write it. But yeah, so I could probably, one thing that is well known, I think, about this movie is that Jack Nicholson ad-libbed the line, "Here's Johnny," when he busts through the door. It also holds the record. I don't know if it still does. It holds the record for the most takes on one scene. So
for which scene?
It took, it doesn't specifically say here, but it says it took 127 takes for a scene with Shelley Duvall. retakes of a single scene, it was 127. It which I was going into saying that supposedly Shelley Duvall and Kubrick didn't get along, and I assumed that was the reason why. But the last fact that I have, so there's so many facts, and they're all pretty interesting. I highly recommend reading about it to whoever's listening. But so Garrett Brown, the inventor of the Steadicam, which we all kind of know what that is, right? When you're filming and you can move your arm and it stays steady. It's named correctly. Operated the famous Steadicam shots in the film himself. So I thought it was kind of interesting that the guy who actually invented the Steadicam filmed a lot of the shots. The Shining was only the 7th film to use this technique after Bound for Glory, Marathon Man, Rocky, Exorcist 2, the Buddy Holly story, Rocky 2, and Fame. Actually, I'll do one last one because I didn't have any on Scatman Crothers. It supposedly took 60 takes in a scene where a camera simply zooms in on Scatman Crothers in his bedroom. This is when he's in Miami. The 70-year-old Crothers came so exasperated with Kubrick's compulsive style that he broke down and cried, prompting Jack Nicholson to swear he'd never work with Kubrick again.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, so those are some interesting facts about that old movie.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and I find it really strange how Stephen King has been on the record like forever that he didn't like this movie.
Yeah.
Because I think it is by far one of the best adaptations of one of his books.
Right.
And he talked about, it kind of ruining the feel of the book or the progression or whatever. Whereas I feel like it kind of did the opposite. Because we've done Stephen King movies before, like with It and Carrie. And then I watched the new Pet Sematary a while back as well, after I read the book. And I've also read a number of his books. And something that makes it hard, I feel like, to translate his writing to film is what makes them disturbing is like that slow build in the mood and the way that things just kind of escalate and until it finally explodes into what your worst fear is.
Yeah.
And I think something that really hurt, like the Pet Sematary remake, for example, is that it felt like they were just trying to fit every scene from the book into an hour and a half. And it was also rushed that you didn't have time to really connect with the characters or worry about what was happening. And it was just like riding a bullet train through a novel. And The Shining, to me, felt like the exact opposite, in that I thought it was perfectly paced for the story. And I feel like the horror of it translated well in that way. Like, it was just more of that subtle build where things were getting worse and worse. But it gave you time to actually understand the characters and to get their background and to know why what was happening was especially scary. So I thought that it was actually a really good translation, and I think that this was the movie that I've watched that felt most like reading a Stephen King book.
Yeah, I agree with that. I could see what he was saying as far as with Jack Nicholson goes. I could see why he would, because the idea of the movie is that he's, sane. He was an alcoholic, but sane, and then goes into being crazy. And, Jack Nicholson, one of the greatest actors of all time. Also, probably just like one of the coolest guys of all time.
Yeah, I can see that.
I was thinking about that. I think he's probably just one of the coolest, but, I could definitely see trying to get someone who could look more normal and then go crazy at the towards the end, build up to craziness. Now, that being said, they mentioned how he was an alcoholic and that he did hurt Danny's arm, and so it's like, well, maybe he was kind of crazy all along, and this is just what kind of opened it up. But that's neither here nor there. But yeah, this movie for sure makes me want to read The Shining. In fact, Katie just started it because we watched this yesterday.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I am inspired to read it as well. And I have a lot of questions about the story, but we can get into that more later. But just as far as how the movie was made, I thought the filming was really great. And I'm not going to go into a lot about that because they're whole documentaries. But if you're interested, there's one we saw on Netflix a long time ago that I believe was just called Room 237.
Yep, that's the one I was.
And I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but you can rent it on Amazon. And it was really good. And it talked about a lot of things that Kubrick did deliberately to just mess up like your sense of the layout of the hotel. Mm-hmm. So like they'd show someone go down a hall and then turn left, and then they'd be in the kitchen, and then later on someone would be walking out of like a different room, and they would come out of that same place where the person going into the kitchen had turned in before. So it wasn't a continuity error, it was on purpose so that you never felt like you had your sense of bearings. And that sort of repeated pattern on the carpet was kind of like that as well, because you don't associate that with any one place in the hotel. You just associate it with kind of like going in circles in the hotel, which I thought was such an interesting thing, because they definitely didn't do anything in the movie to point it out. It was just a thing in the background to like mess with you psychologically. Yeah. Which is A+. Good horror movie, Ian.
Yeah. I noticed actually in the scene early on when they're at the hotel and Shelley's bringing the food to Jack. It looks like he's laying, the way that it's shot, there's like a mirror there, and it almost looks like he's straight ahead, so she's walking in with the food, and he's laying on the bed sleeping, and it almost looks like he's straight ahead, and then all of a sudden you realize that it's a mirror and it's facing behind you, or that he's sleeping to the left when you come in. It just like that just threw me off altogether. And being that it's Kubrick, you're like, okay, I'm more than willing to bet that was on purpose. That was the idea of this.
Yeah, the whole thing just made you kind of feel unbalanced, which is, and that I think was a big part too of, we talk about like the tone, and there's probably a better term for it, but with horror movies, you want to slowly build and keep the audience engaged. And something that we've seen with a lot of the movies on this list is they're just boring with nothing to like hook you for the first hour and a half. Yeah. And then you get like 15 minutes of actual like intensity or scare. But I think that for a long movie, it's even harder. So when you have 2.5 hours to fill instead of just an hour and 20 minutes, it's even more difficult to kind of manage that. And I think that this movie actually did an amazing job. Mm-hmm. Like the whole thing just had that sort of dark and foreboding and escalating tone. And even a lot of it was done, I feel like, with just like the music and the sound effects and the camera angles and the way it was shot. And just as an example of that, early on, Danny is in the games room throwing darts, and then the music gets kind of weird, and then he turns around and sees the two little girls in blue dresses holding hands, and then they turn around and leave, and that whole scene just felt super creepy and ominous, even though nothing in like the dialogue or the events made it that way. Because at that point, they could have just been two guests in the hotel,
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. You thought that those like girls, I mean, especially watching, so I had the benefit of watching this for the first time and doing it for the podcast, which was kind of nice, because that's exactly what I thought. I was like, well, because I didn't necessarily know who they were. You hear about Grady killing his wife and daughters, but I didn't really put two. I mean, I kind of did, but it was like those could be all the people just running around, a bunch of weird twins just sitting there holding hands behind you.
Yeah,
it's a nightmare.
It's like the Watson twins behind Jenny Lewis.
Yeah. So it was super strange. It also has like the added benefit of like, for me, and just when you're working all day and like life gets kind of stressful, it's like, man, wouldn't it be nice if I could go to a hotel in Colorado and just like be the only people there with me and my wife and my kids, pups, and just like get away from it all.
Just disconnect.
Yeah, and so it's like you're almost like I was brought in, I was drawn in, because it's like, God, do those like jobs actually exist? Like I had chances. I mean, I had chance freezing to death in the maze. Yeah, sure. Just to get away, that would be amazing. But
yeah, and I do think that especially the mom and Danny, they made pretty sympathetic
Yeah.
the mom because she was just trying so hard to keep everything together, and Danny because he clearly was going through some stuff.
God dang. Yeah.
But yeah, just in general, you kind of felt connected to those characters, and as the movie went on, their danger sort of added to why you felt scared.
Yeah.
And so I really liked that they showed a lot of the discovery of what was going on from the mom's perspective instead of from Jack's. So like that scene where she's walking around the hotel with the baseball bat looking for Jack, and she sees, she goes up to his typewriter and sees where he's just been typing all work and no play, makes Jack a dull boy, and then notices that he's just been typing that over and over and over, page after page, as she's flipping through them. And then there's like that building sound behind it, and then the dissonant strings music, and then you see him the camera switches to his perspective as he's like walking in behind her, and just that feeling of like danger on her behalf after the revelation that's just happened of what's been going on, like that was just such good, creepy, scary horror movie making.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah. It makes you, it was like, that was like a perfect scene as far as horror goes. Like that, the music, the build up, all that was like a perfect horror scene.
Yeah.
And you had a little chase afterward.
With them like facing each other and it like switching back and forth between the faces. Yeah.
No, I was saying earlier that, I can understand the whole, you want to see Jack like go from sane to crazy, but Jack Nicholson plays a perfect crazy person.
Oh yeah.
And so once it got to that part, like when he initially snapped on Shelley Duvall's character early on, it was like that was 100% believable. Like he played it so well, and it was almost like there was no remorse, which as it would be with the character who's starting to lose it. Like there was no remorse there. There was no like apology or anything. Like he just snapped, and he did that. That was like on point.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think he was great for the role, and maybe not for an exact translation of the way that Stephen King had the story in his mind, but for making a good horror movie,
right.
I thought he was a good choice. But there's something else I wanted to talk about that I think I've had kind of a revelation about with horror movies in general, based on the last few that we've watched, and that is the importance of hope.
Okay.
And I feel like for a movie to really, truly be scary, there has to be at least some level of hope that the characters that you're empathizing with are going to survive.
Yeah.
Because if there's not, then it's almost like it makes you not as empathetic towards them. And so like with this one, I thought they did a good job of always kind of dangling it just out of reach.
Yeah.
So like at first the radio was there. So you're like, okay, well no matter how bad things get, they can always radio for help. And then there was that snowcat kind of covered snowmobile thing. And you're like, okay, well, no matter how bad it gets, she can always get outside and get in that and get to safety. And then you have that ghost or whatever it was of Grady telling Jack about Dick coming to try and stop him. And that was like a warning. That was like hey, there's an outside force that could change the outcomes of what you're planning to do. And then, it's getting worse and worse at the hotel, but it keeps cutting to Dick traveling out there, and every time he meets an obstacle he's able to get past it, so he's able to eventually he's on the way always as things are escalating. So it's almost like this race, like that it's time sensitive, that what's happening in the hotel is preventable if someone can make it just in time,
right? And
so that kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole way, and it's like the danger is growing but the door isn't closed on escape. So it just gives you more emotional investment in the characters and in their survival, which keeps you like pulled into the movie. And so I think that movies that don't have that, so anyway, with movies that don't have that, you don't have that same investment. Like there's no reason to really feel stressed for the characters because it's over. So like with Human Centipede, 2/3 of the way through the movie is game over. The thing you were scared of has already happened. You don't really have any hope. Like if someone rescues them, they're still disfigured forever. It's just like I don't know, it doesn't have the same sense of urgency, and so for me it doesn't have that same thing that makes you scared on behalf of the character.
I could see that. I think just on the other side of this, I could also kind of see the no hope in horror movies if it's done well enough, because you almost have that terror feeling of being trapped. Like you put yourself in those shoes that there's no way out, and that's kind of the horror that's coming. But yeah, if it were my preference, I would, pick as long as you have the hope to get out, that's also the horror aspect of trying to get out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like kind of playing with that too is a thing, a way that, the movie can mess with you.
Yeah.
And so that's I'm starting to feel like that's an important element in the movies that I find actually scary.
Yeah, and I think if it's set up well enough too, like this movie had done. So this movie, the whole purpose of him going out there is because they closed down from October to May, and because of the storm or snow and weather and getting people out there. So going into this that it's that's going to happen, and so that's like starts it off, and then that you have the snowcat, and then you hear that's going. So if it's done well enough, I think it's easier for me to like the movie, which is what we're all worried about. But and this one, I mean, I love the movies. Like, even if it's a bad movie, I appreciate the fact if they answer some of the questions of like, why are they stuck out here? It's not just like a random event, I think it kind of helps. Why can't they get into the snowcat? Like, if they never addressed the snowcat and how he sabotaged the first one, then we would have been saying, why don't you get into snowcat? But
and I think that's one area where the movie benefits from being based on a book by a very talented writer. The story elements have been well constructed. But anyway, I thought it was a great movie, and I thought that it was actually scary, and this will go on my own top 50 list for sure. But one thing I want to talk about real quick before we're done, I am still very confused about a lot of the story. So, like, Danny and Dick both had The Shining, which Dick explains to some extent, and that's, I guess Danny was having premonitions about things that would happen at the hotel and had happened at the hotel in the past. And that all seems pretty straightforward, and I get it. But what I'm not sure about is everything with Jack. Like, at first, it seemed really obvious. Like, he just went to this hotel and went crazy there from the isolation. But then there's all this stuff with, like, the ghost telling him that he's always been there. And then that old picture at the end from the 20s where it shows him at the party at the hotel. And I am completely lost as to how that fits in.
So I want to say this since we're fixing to end on this. I want to shout out Danny too. Like, that character, I thought that was really good. Like the whole the whole acting, and just the whole Tony part and the voice that he made was really creepy. It's just like that. Should give us a little shout out.
Yeah. Also, what was Tony? And how did that fit into anything?
Well, I wonder if that was The Shining. But I also wondered if Danny inherited some sort of The Shining from Jack Nicholson, from Jack's character. And the reason why I say that is because Jack also had had Grady, and but so I looked up. I needed help with the ending of this movie, or I was curious about it because it shows him in the 1920 picture. And one thing it was talking about was how Grady says in the bathroom, like, no, you've always been the what was the word I'm saying?
Like the caretaker.
You've always been the caretaker. And then with the picture at the end, one of the theories about it is that now Jack's just part of the history of all the accidents that have happened there. He's part of that's all the ghosts that were at the hotel, almost like a reunion picture. And there's the other theory saying that, like, basically the men who are taken over by like the craze of needing to kill their wife and kids. It's like one spirit, and it just kind of goes to person that's there, and that's what convinces them. But in this, basically, it was saying that Shelley and Danny broke that tradition of the killing because like at the beginning when they're explaining the whole Grady thing, it seems like everything's kind of super secretive in a way. You have that weird guy who's just sitting in the room with Jack and the owner or whatever. So you knew that some weird things happened there. And
they're definitely like downplaying it.
Right. And so then, but anyway, I don't know if that really helped or hurt. It was definitely interesting when I saw that. Like, it was one of those, like, at the very end, it was like, oh, okay, so this is there's a little bit more meaning to this.
Yeah, well, and then, too, like, he seemed to know the bartender. Right. You know what I mean? Yeah. He seemed, like, overly familiar with him. And it was almost like I don't know. So maybe it was, like, The Shining for him as well. And he was just experiencing past things from the hotel, but, like, embracing it more or something. I don't know. Yeah. But anyway, when you had mentioned that, Katie immediately started reading the book, I'm also inspired to read the book just because I feel like there are probably better answers to those questions. And I'm really interested to know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it'll be good. Anyway, this is, like you were saying, this is not only, like, I mean, just after watching it all the way through for the first time, like, this I would say is probably one of my top favorite movies. Like, I can't wait to watch this again.
Yeah. Yep. It's really good. I want to go back and rewatch that documentary about it as well.
I should do that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Good times.
Good job on the list, my man.
Well, don't speak too prematurely.
I know. Still got some left.
Yeah. Especially the next one. And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.